By the start of the 19th century, the British East India Company had become the dominant power across the subcontinent, expanding in every direction. Britain came to realize the vast productive potential of India and sought to protect this asset by any means necessary. At the same time, Russia's imperial expansion started to gain real momentum by the 1820s, as it sought to make its way south beyond the Caucasus Mountains. Although not anywhere near the Indian border, Russia's rise worried the British. This great game rivalry placed the mountainous Kingdom of Afghanistan in the middle. The ever-ambitious Afghan ruler, Dost Mohammad Khan, made every effort to take advantage of this predicament that he found himself in. But in the end, his intrigues and plans were not well received by the British, whose paranoid belligerence led them to invade Afghanistan for the first time in 1839. The beginning of the 19th century was a time of great turmoil in Afghan politics. The Durrani Empire, established by Ahmad Shah Durrani, had descended into civil wars as his grandsons fought one another for supremacy. As the brothers competed with one another, the empire established by their grandfather dwindled until all that was left was Afghanistan. In the east, the Sikhs had become formidable foes to the Afghans, wresting control of Punjab from them. Under the leadership of Ranjit Singh, the Sikh Khalsa had even threatened the city of Peshawar, the winter capital of the Durrani Empire. In the backdrop of all this internal conflict, the Muhammadza'i family rose to important positions of power within the royal court. Although they were from the ruling Durrani Confederacy, they came from a different tribe called the Barakzai. By 1823, the Barakzai dynasty had toppled the Durrani dynasty and asserted their control over the realm. Under the helm of Amir Dost Mohammad Khan, the Afghans enjoyed greater stability and were even focused on addressing the Sikh threat from the east. As Afghanistan was sorting out its internal issues, neighbouring India was going through its own radical changes. Long gone were the days of Mughal supremacy. By the 1820s, the Marathas, who had confined the Mughal emperor to Delhi, had themselves been sidelined by the British as the dominant force on the subcontinent. Under the auspices of the East India Company, the British colonial presence in India went from strength to strength, as they created a sprawling bureaucracy and disciplined army that formed the bedrock of their political power. And they were well rewarded for it. India was rich with resources which could help the Brits bankroll their industrialization on the British Isles, as well as their colonial projects overseas. Britain's main competitor in Europe in this period was Russia, which had similar aims of colonial expansion. The Russians had pushed their borders southward into the Caucasus Mountains, but were yet to make forays into Central Asia. Nevertheless, the British still feared Russian designs on India, regardless of their feasibility. There were worries in London that Russia's desire for a warm water port could see it expand its presence towards the Indian Ocean through Persia or Afghanistan, thus bringing them into direct conflict with British interests in India. In such a political atmosphere, Afghanistan became a powder keg for the British, and any Russian interference in the country would be a cause for concern for the Viceroy in India. This rivalry was later dubbed as the Great Game. Of course, the Afghans were not passive bystanders in all of this. Dost Mohammad, or the Dost as he was known by the British, tried to benefit from the rivalry which threatened his realm by politically maneuvering between the two European powers. He could use the situation to his advantage and tried to solicit the return of Peshawar to Afghan control, which by the mid-1830s had definitively fallen to the Sikhs. Considering their proximity to the Sikh Empire, Dost Muhammad preferred to side with the British over the Russians. In 1837, he wrote to Lord Auckland, the British Viceroy of India, proposing an alliance if the British would support his quest to regain Peshawar. Auckland responded with a message that would come back to haunt him, stating, "My friend, you are aware that it is not the practice of the British government to interfere with the affairs of other independent states." In order to placate the Emir, Auckland sent a delegation to Kabul headed by Alexander Burnes. Burnes had previously met the Emir 5 years before on his journey towards Central Asia, and the two got along very well. Unbeknownst to the Afghan ruler, Burnes had been given explicit instruction to not agree to any formal alliance. He was in Kabul to try to learn more about the Russian involvement in Afghanistan. With his advances being constantly rejected by Burnes, the Dost started to get frustrated. At the same time, a Russian arrived in Kabul by the name of Jan Vitkovich, who claimed to be an envoy of the Tsar. Oddly enough, Vitkovich was never confirmed to be an official Russian envoy, and would later commit suicide under mysterious circumstances. His presence in the Afghan court did, however, terrify the British, even more so when Vitkovich proposed the establishment of a Russian diplomatic mission stationed in Kabul. In a bid to force the British Viceroy's hand, Dost Muhammad leaked details of the meeting so that he could push the British into granting him the alliance that he wanted. Viceroy Auckland did not like what he heard, especially since his trusted and hawkish advisor, William Hay McNaughton, urged him to take action against Dost Muhammad. The British demanded that Dost Muhammad stop all communication with the Russians. The Afghan ruler asked the viceroy to put the terms in writing and sign a formal alliance, to which he heard no response from India. So he met with Vitkovich again. This was the last straw. Determined to stop Afghanistan from being drawn into the Russian orbit, Viceroy Auckland decided to depose the Dost. The British position was strengthened by the fact that Shah Shuja, a grandson of Ahmad Shah Durrani and a former ruler of Afghanistan, had been living on a British pension in India and was therefore a suitable replacement for Dost Muhammad. In October 1838, the order was given to invade Afghanistan so that Dost Muhammad could be dethroned and Afghanistan could be saved from foreign intervention. The irony was obviously lost on the viceroy. The army of the Indus consisted of just over 30,000 soldiers, with an even greater number of camp followers. Prior to moving on Afghanistan, the British had to deal with the fact that the Sikh Empire lay between it and Dost Muhammad's realm. Thankfully for the British, Ranjit Singh was more than glad to see his old Afghan rival undermined. Therefore, he had no qualms with the invading army of the Indus going through his realm. Passing through the Bolan Pass in March 1839, the British were delighted that the former Afghan capital of Kandahar was taken without a fight the following month. In July, the intimidating fortress of Ghazni was taken when a young British officer named Henry Marion Durand laid satchel charges which blew the gates open. Interestingly enough, his son Henry Mortimer Durand would be the person that the famous Durand line would be named after. By August, Dost Mohammad had fled the capital and the British triumphantly entered Kabul with Shah Shuja. Having established him on the throne, the British soon found out that Shah Shuja was a largely incapable ruler. Stories of his brutality became well known. Nonetheless, the Shah's power was limited by Macnaghten, who had accompanied the expedition as Britain's chief representative in Kabul. Burnes had also accompanied the mission as Macnaghten's number 2. British garrisons were created in Kandahar, Ghazni, Jalalabad, and of course Kabul. Certain sub-tribes within the Ghilzai Confederacy were paid off by the British to keep the supply lines between Kabul and the Khyber Pass open. For the time being, there seemed to be an eerie sense of acceptance from the Afghans of the new foreign occupiers. This was not lost upon the British, who called for their families to come to Kabul, bringing amenities such as cigars and whiskey with them. The British cantonment in the capital was walled, and a community arose that sought to establish a British way of life inside of it. They had cricket matches, tea parties, and theatre shows. As for Dost Mohammad, he was nowhere to be seen. After his initial escape in 1839, the Dost had fled north to Bukhara, where he was imprisoned by the local ruler. Eventually escaping, he re-entered Afghanistan with a small force of Uzbeks. The British were disturbed by these reports, but they were pleasantly surprised in November 1840 when Dost Mohammad personally appeared before Macnaghten and voluntarily surrendered. On the back of such a commanding position, British policymakers in London felt that their aims had been achieved in Afghanistan, and there was no point in further draining the Indian treasury. Much of their forces were ordered to withdraw, leaving only a force of 8,000 in Afghanistan. In the summer of 1841, Macnaghten had written to a colleague in India that Afghanistan was perfectly quiet. Not everyone in the British camp believed this though. The British commander of the armed forces, Major General Roberts, whose son would play a leading role in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, resigned in protest of the actions taken by the British political administration. He was replaced by the elderly figure of William Elphinstone. The honeymoon period soon unravelled for the British. By 1841, Afghan discontent began to rise to the surface. The general state of security started to decline as robbers and outlaws increased their activities. To confound matters, Wazir Akbar Khan, the capable and charismatic son of Dost Mohammad, soon became a leader of the resistance. He looked to disturb the supply lines and raided roads connecting the cities. As 1841 progressed, there were episodes of attacks on British personnel in the cities as well. The gradual increase in tension and crime was an omen of the future. In a bid to save money, the British payments to the Ghilzai tribesmen for keeping the eastern supply routes open had also been cut. The tribesmen did not take this well and began routine attacks on the British supply lines. Brits inside of Afghanistan were not safe, not even in Kabul. In November 1841, there was an attack on Alexander Burnes' residence. In the months before, rumours abounded across Kabul that British soldiers were fraternizing with Afghan women. In such a highly patriarchal society, this was considered absolutely unacceptable by the Afghans. So a crowd gathered outside the house of Burnes, who had chosen to live outside the British cantonment. The angry mob wanted to express their disapproval of the foreigners. On that day, however, Burnes had been hosting a few local women in his house. The crowd became incensed by this contempt for their culture and became violent. Burns was caught and beaten to death by the angry mob. These developments forced the British leadership in Kabul to realize the danger of the situation. McNaughton reached out to Wazir Akbar Khan in order to negotiate, thinking that the Afghan uprising was under the prince's control. At the same time, he secretly asked the British garrison in Kandahar to come with their forces to Kabul. Somehow, Akbar Khan found out about this plan to double-cross him and ended up killing McNaughton when they met in December. The elderly and ineffective Elphinstone was now in charge of the British in Kabul. He agreed to surrender Kabul to Akbar Khan in return for safe passage to the British garrison in Jalalabad. At the beginning of January 1842, the British evacuated Kabul and set upon their journey eastward. More than 16,000 people, with 4,500 being military personnel and the rest civilians. They had to travel 140 kilometers across the snow-capped Hindu Kush mountains in the midst of the harsh Afghan winter. What the British failed to firmly understand was that the Afghan insurrection was not engineered by or under the control of a single figure. Whilst Akbar Khan was an influential leader, the uprising was a natural outgrowth of Afghan resentment at the British occupation of their country. Therefore, the revolt was far more decentralized and unstructured than the British assumed. As a result, Akbar Khan was never in a position to guarantee the safety of the British journey from Kabul to Jalalabad, because the tribes on that route did not necessarily take their orders from the prince. Over the next week, the local tribes took up positions along the mountain range with their respective long-range Jazayl rifles and intermittently opened fire on the retreating British. Between the tribesmen and the harsh cold weather, the British column was completely wiped out. The episode is often considered as the greatest humiliation faced by the British during the 19th century, and has helped Afghanistan gain a reputation as a graveyard of empires. The lone figure of Dr. William Bryden in this painting has popularized the mistaken belief that he was the only survivor from the ordeal, when in reality, several Indian sepoys reached Jalalabad over the coming weeks. Despite this disaster, the British still had garrisons in Kandahar, Ghazni, and Jalalabad. The Afghans were able to take Ghazni, but the Brits held out in Jalalabad and Kandahar, giving them enough time for relief forces to arrive from India in the spring of 1842. By this time, Lord Ellenborough had replaced Lord Auckland as the Viceroy in India, and had been given instructions by London to bring an end to the war in Afghanistan, after punishing the Afghans and reclaiming some lost glory. The already present contingents of British troops inside the country were aided by a relief column referred to as the Army of Retribution, which was instructed to march upon the capital and secure the release of British prisoners taken on the retreat from Kabul. Along the way, the British committed many acts of reprisals against villages and their inhabitants. In September, the historic bazaar of Kabul was burnt down. Having exacted their revenge and achieved their revised aims, the British completely withdrew from Afghanistan in October 1842. Shah Shuja had been assassinated earlier in the spring of 1842, and so the position for the ruler of Afghanistan was open. A position which was filled by none other than Dost Mohammad, who was released from captivity by the British at the end of the year and warned against opening up to the Russians again. Over the next 20 years, Dost Mohammad would spread his authority to all the major cities in Afghanistan. Peshawar, however, was never regained again by the Afghans. In 1863, he was succeeded by his son Sher Ali, who would find himself in a similar predicament to his father when his country once again faced the spectre of a British invasion in the late 1870s. Thank you guys for watching. As usual, I want to thank my patrons for being awesome and generous, especially the latest ones, Zaki, Barakdan, and Sam Aranau, who actually has a YouTube channel on Jewish history under his own name. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Before I go, I also want to thank the talented Mariam Kakar for her awesome drawing of the attack on Alexander Burns' residence. I'll leave her Instagram details in the description below as well. Make sure you check out her work. Until next time, peace!